Здравствуйте, коллеги. Позвольте мне представить профессора Флорена де Денишена из Франции. Он профессор Национального института прикладных наук в Лионе, специалист по компьютерной арифметике, по широкому спектру вопросов, в том числе по разработке, как это по-русски сказать, application specific ядер, арифметических ядер. Он архитектор открытого проекта FlopOCO и один из авторов Handbook of Floating Point Arithmetic. Пожалуйста.
Спасибо огромное. Я принимаю вопросы по-русски, но я буду писать на английском. У меня русские девушки, я очень хорошо говорю с детьми, с наукой это трудно. So that's the general subject of my research. So I hope I'm going to say things that interest you and that are not too far from what you want to work on. So there's a bit about software and a bit about hardware. So each part is about half an hour. So I start with the software part. So that's the outline in general. I'm motivated about studying the trade-off between performance and accuracy. So it's something. Accuracy is often taken out of the cost-performance trade-off. And for people doing verification, for example, it's often all black or all white. And I want to study it in a more continuous way. So let's start. The common wisdom is that the more expensive, if you want something accurately, if you're many digits of pi, you need to pay a lot of computing power to compute with high accuracy. So that's common wisdom. In practice, you notice when the computation is not accurate enough, something silly happens, like this, which happens in Excel from time to time. Or you have an accident, a building will collapse, or the stock options will vanish, etc. So something will happen. In most of the times, if nothing happens here, it means that you are too accurate. It's not that you're just accurate to the accuracy you need, you're much more accurate than what you need. So my research goal is in general to try to gain performance by computing less accurately than the standard, but still accurately enough. So that's general. That's the goal I'm going to survey in software and in hardware. Okay. So I don't know if you know that, for example, the common arithmetic that you have in your desktop processor, and now in your mobile phone. So the border between desktop processors and embedded processors is really blurring these days. So the smartphones are really getting this kind of computing power. So there's less and less relevance having this column. And anyway, we have two mainstream floating point formats. One is 64 bits, including 53 bits of Mantissa. So that's where we have the accuracy. And the second one is 32 bits. Is that okay? So you just ask questions. So many people are really confused about these types, especially the floating point types, especially when you teach in the beginning, because it's completely nonsense the way it's named in common languages. Like in C, the numeric types, the smallest one is called char, so it's a name from typography. And for example, you can have unsigned char, which doesn't mean anything. I mean, a character can be signed or unsigned. And why not male or female? And then you can add two chars, and you don't get the superposition of two chars, you get a number, etc. So it doesn't make sense. Int is a name from mathematics, it's an evolution from integer. And of course, it's not exactly integer arithmetic. Like you add this number on this on one, and you get something negative, which is not the usual behavior of integer arithmetic. So it's actually integer modulo 2 to the 32 or 2 to the 64. Okay. Then you have adjectives like short and long. So these were nouns. It's all naming the same types. I mean, they should have at least the same grammatical class, but not. Then you have a verb, which is float. At least it's a computer type. It's for floating point. And then you have again an adjective, double, which doesn't mean anything if you don't say what you double. And then you have things like long double, that's a numeric type. And of course, nobody can expect to predict what it's going to mean, because in English it doesn't mean anything. So yeah, if you're lost at this point, it's normal. When you learn C or C++, you have all this nonsensical heritage from the 60s. So saying it again, single precision is the 32-bit format. And since you probably know that 2 to the 10 is more or less 10 to the 3, so these 24 bits give us roughly 7 decimal digits. That's the main thing I want to say here. And 7 digits is a lot. That's the precision you use when you play Angry Birds on your mobile phone. And you input trajectories with an accuracy which is much less than 10 to the minus 7, right? It's difficult to buy instruments that measure to more than 10 to the minus 4. So it doesn't make sense to compute with that accuracy for playing games. Double precision is the format with 53 bits of multisat, so that's 16 decimal digits. If you apply the same rule, 10 to the 10, 2 to the 10 is 10 to the 3. Again, it's completely overkill for most of the applications, and in particular, the people who need the most precision are the physicists, and the physicists just really find the standard units that we are going to use forever now, instead of these bits of metal that we had in Paris, which was defined in the kilogram. So now the kilogram is defined by a combination of these constants, and none of these constants has more than 10 digits, which more or less means that none of the current physics needs to be more accurate than 10 to the minus 10. And we have 16 digits, so it's totally overkill. So why do we have such overkill of precision? Yeah, it seems some boffins have been able to compute something up to 14 decimal digits once. And G, the gravitation, the universal gravitation constant, is known to 3 decimal digits. And we are able to send things to Jupiter, and that's about, to send something in orbit on Jupiter, you need 10 to the minus 10 accuracy, so if you aim right? And that's possible because we compensate from the uncertainty we have on G by looking where the probe is going, and it has motors. Okay, so why do we have these 16 decimal digits of accuracy? Again, I'm saying all this is about introduction because I want to recover some of these waste to compute cheaply, more economically. So my PC computes roughly 10 to the 9, 10 to the 10 operations per second. And that's a lot of numbers. So there's this German guy who did this nice allegory that if you have a good printer, you print 5 columns of numbers in 100 lines on a sheet of paper, double-sided. And so if you print all these numbers per second on a standard paper, office paper, you know that these packs of papers, that's 500 sheets, about 5 centimeters. So 10 centimeters is about 1,000 sheets of paper. And so this number of operations per second, it's a pile of paper that moves at 100 meters per second, or roughly the speed of a plane that takes off. And then we are building much more powerful computers, like 10 to the 12 operations per second, and such a computer could print to the moon in 1 second. So it's a huge, huge amount of computing power we have in a small PC like that. And of course, each of these operations is floating point, so they may involve a small error, which is roughly of this last digit that we have. So the order of magnitude of the rounding error is bounded by this. And these errors accumulate during the computation. So that means that if you switch on your petaflop computer, the most expensive computer on earth, after 1 second it's computing garbage because the accumulation of all the rounding errors has rendered the result meaningless. So we have this accuracy just to accumulate errors in them. So that's the reason why we have such accurate format. Okay? And it sounds wrong somehow. You want to have digits to compute meaningful things, not to compute garbage. So I want to master accuracy to get performance. That's my research goal. The sub goals are I have to know how accurate I compute. I want you to know how accurate you do your computations, or your students. And for this, you need to know what accuracy you need. And that's actually the most difficult problem. So I've studied that for very small objects, like elementary functions, which is the bulk of this talk. And then sum of products for the second part, and we are working on larger linear algebra objects. So it's very low level kind of computations. But that's the situation, the course for which we know what accuracy we need and how to get, how accurate we do the computation. So we are building it. And of course, computing just right also means that you know what accuracy you compute. So it entails that you know that you compute right. So it's not just I'm trying to sabotage the computation. I'm trying to improve it and to prove that it's correct. So in software, there's one general technique. So I'm getting to get a bit more detail now, which is to have a routine in order to be fast in average, but always accurate enough. You can have a quick and dirty routine, like the ones people do every day, but then you have a test that checks if this routine was accurate enough. And if the test fails, you launch something which is more accurate, but more expensive. But since you don't launch it too often, the average time can be close to the quick and dirty routine. Okay? So I'm going to detail these for elementary functions. And the main message here is that the additional work is not to write the expensive accurate routine. Everybody knows how to write expensive accurate routines. You just take Mathematica or Maple and you have as many digits as you want. The difficult thing is to design this runtime test. And to design this runtime test, you need to know how accurate you compute. So that's where you've got proof. So I'm getting closer to verification. Obviously not the same kind of verification you do, but that's where you need to understand and engineer the accuracy. And it has to be done at a very serious proof level. So let's take as an example elementary functions correctly rounded. So that's the first half of my research. And the second half is about hardware. So elementary functions are sine, cosine, exponential, logarithms. It's something you have in a black box. You just use them as you use the basic operations. And actually they are implemented in software. Your PC includes a standard mathematical library which is called libm in C. Usually it's not perfect. It's not correctly rounded, the libm, in the sense as, I have a slide for that, but later. When you have a floating point addition, what your hardware computes is the perfect result. So it computes the sum exactly, and then it rounds it to the target format, and you can do better. So you have only 64 bits to live in, but it's really rounding the exact mathematical result of the addition. And for the elementary functions, we didn't have this standard of quality. We had something which is like functions more or less work. They are accurate to 10 to minus something, and that's good. So this research goal was to reach this correct rounding objective for the function, so that they have the same quality as the basic operators. And we pushed for that. We included in the standards that defines floating point in 2008. Before that, it was really considered too expensive. And the reason, if you get down to the mathematics, why it's expensive to get this correct rounding of the elementary functions, I'm going to illustrate it on something which is called the table maker's dilemma. So it's not that people doing tables like this, it's people doing tables of logarithms. I'll probably just show you a table of logarithms from the 17th century. So how do you compute these numbers? They did all this by hand without a computer. And they need these 12 digits here. So what they do is a polynomial approximation using Taylor, using theorems, that gives 14 digits. And so what you compute, it's an uncertainty you have on your result, right? And usually it's good enough to round. Like if you have these digits plus 17, you know you have to round down. If you have these digits plus 83, you know you have to round up. So you add 1 to the last digit and that's it. And then sometimes you have your 2 digits are 50. And so you don't know if you should round up or round down. You're exactly in the middle. And since you have this uncertainty, you might need to round up or down. So it's no big deal because that's the numbers which are exactly very close to the middle. So it's harmless to round up or down. It's more or less the same error, right? But it's called the table maker dilemma. Another thing is that it's the first digital signature algorithm because when people spend half their life computing such a table by hand, they didn't want it to be copied by the next guy.
We have an example here about story.
So you don't want anybody to be able to copy it. So you want to be able to detect if a table is a copy or if somebody did the work, did the computations. So what you do is each time you fall on this case, which is more or less one case out of 100. You see, if you have 2 more digits, it happens once in 100 cases. So in 100 cases, you take a decision to round up or down, and you have your private copy and you note if you round it up or down. And then if a competitor outputs a table, you just open it and look at these roundings. And if it's taken the same decision as you, it means it copied. So you have it's a digital signature. So it's an instance of the algorithm which I gave you. So there's a guy at IBM that wrote a correctly rounded implementations of elementary functions. So you initialize with an epsilon and you compute y such that it's the same but basically in binary. So you know that your exact y, your exact function you want to compute is more or less within an epsilon so this is the floating point numbers. So that's a floating point number, that's a floating point number, that's a floating point number. And the floating point numbers are very discrete among the reals. And so if all your interval is on the same size of the middle point, then you can round and you return it and that's it. You return the result you have. And sometimes your interval of confidence contains a middle between 2 floating point numbers. So that's again my 50 situation of the previous slide. And then you launch the dilemma, so you launch a new computation by reducing epsilon, and you go back to the previous case. And actually it's a while loop. So while you need to reduce the precision, you reduce the precision. And this loop entails that it's an infinite loop if one of the values of your function is exactly a middle point. There's a nice theorem from the 60s that shows that it never happens for exponent log and sine and cosine, etc. But for example, it happens for log in radix 10 or log in radix 2, which are also elementary functions. So for these functions, you first need to filter out this case and it's very expensive for one. Okay. My boss at the time, Jean-Michel Muller, had a PhD student compute the workspaces. We have only 2 to the 64 floating point numbers. So it's a large number, but not an infinite number. So there is a worst case. One of them is as close as possible to the middle point. And if you know what's the worst case, you just have to compute more correctly than you know that if your interval is smaller than the distance between this worst case and the middle point, you'll always be able to correctly round. So if you didn't understand that, it's not very important, but the net effect is that we can replace this while loop with something which is a 2-step, and that's what I have here. We compute the first approximation, we test if we can round it, and if we cannot, we compute the second approximation, and we are sure that rounding the second approximation will give us the correctly rounded result. Because the epsilon 2 here is smaller than the distance between the number among my 2 to the 64 floating point number that is closer to the midpoint. Now, back to my motivation. I want to have performance. So the average time of this computation is the time to compute the first approximation, quick and dirty, plus the probability of going for the second step times the cost of the second step. Right. So we try to balance that. This is quick and dirty, and we try to have this term as small as possible. Again, we need these bounds of errors to be tight, so we need a proof that is serious. And tight means we don't want to overestimate the bounds. In particular, because if we overestimate the bound of the first that we use here to do the test, so suppose we have a computation which is fairly accurate, but we overestimate the error bound, so we overestimate the interval, then we have more numbers that will fall in this case. The smaller the interval, the better, right? So overestimating epsilon 1 degrades the probability of launching the second step, so it degrades the performance. Okay. So that was the first thesis. My first PhD student spent 3 years to design an algorithm in 2 steps only, which had more or less T1 100 cycles, which was state of the art, so like the standard functions. P2, T2 was more or less 10 cycles, so the overhead of correct rounding was only 10 cycles, which we considered acceptable. And it took a full PhD to do this, one function. And the conclusion was the performance of the code is okay, we can say that, but the performance of the programmer is not okay. So we need to reduce the coffee consumption of the programmers, and that's because you have to write the proof of epsilon 1, so the proof that your code is accurate enough. So just to show you an excerpt of the thesis, so that's 3 lines of the code of the sine function. And there's a lot of tricks hidden in this line. The tricks that the code is reordered in such a way to be as accurate as possible and as fast as possible. So we use the fact that the sine is a knot function, so it's a kind of Taylor. We usually use a polynomial in y squared. And actually, so there's an error in this operation. There's an error in all these operations, and we have to accumulate all these errors, and that's what it looks like. And there's a few things which we know that ruin the proof. Like we do computations in Maple, and Maple is not guaranteed, so there's no. And actually, we have examples where Maple fails for this kind of computation that we are computing here. So after these 3 years, including 2 years for writing the proof, the conclusion was nobody should trust such a proof. And anyway, nobody reads it. So there's one poor guy had to review this proof for the PhD defense, and he said, never again, don't do that anymore. So we developed formal proof tools that help us for that. So the conclusion was we want something automatic that just takes the C code of our elementary function and parses it and computes on it and say, okay, the accuracy is, and gives a number. And I hope you understand that it's completely hopeless, in particular because when you write this kind of code, what it's supposed to compute is not written. Okay, so you don't know what you have to say the accuracy with respect to something, and you don't know what you're computing. And then all these tricks are based on mathematical properties of the function, which are not written in the code either. So what we wrote is a tool called GAPA, and I could speak for hours about it, but I really won't try today. It takes your C code, and it also forces you to write what are you supposed to compute. And again, that's the main thing. I'll just get back to my hand proof. There's not even a comment here that says that this computes a sine. So how the tool should know that this computes a sine. So actually, the tool also forces you to express your trick. So when it fails to give an error, you have to add to help it. So it's a formal proof tool. You know the formal proof tools, like so many of you have heard of Coq or PVS or these kind of tools. They don't do the proof. They force you to write it very, very, very accurately, in a detailed way. And so GABA, this tool is to copy what C is to assembly code. I don't write assembly code anymore. I can read it, but I don't write it. I have a C compiler that does that for me. And GABA is writing the code for me out of a high-level specification of the proof. So typically for something that is about 10 lines of C code, you get 30 lines of GABA. You have to write 20 lines of proof on top of your 10 lines of code. And then you get to 27,000 lines of code proof, which take a few minutes to run in code. So it's not a very large number. So I have many slides about GABA. I'm not sure you want to see them. I'll probably just showing you the results. So that's my third PhD student. We had this case that for inclusion of this function that's sign of by x, so this variance of the sign function, we wanted them to be included in the revision of the standard for floating point, actually, so in 2008. 2 days before the standard, somebody told us we cannot standardize that because there's no reference implementation. So we cannot put in the standard something we are not sure somebody can do. So we had to do an implementation in 2 days with the tools we developed, including GABA and another one. We could do that in 2 days instead of a full PhD. In addition, we reduced the worst case from 10,000 to 2,000 to 1,000, so a factor 10 on the performance. The tools that we use to do that were developed in 3 more PhDs, so we really have a lot to do. Now we are able to develop 16 variants of the same functions with various performance, memory consumption trade-offs in 1 day. And we also have reduced recently the worst case time to less than 100 cycles. So again, that's only possible if you know exactly what you compute and how you compute it. So that's the result of this part. Okay, so I have many slides that go more into detail how you implement LLM functions and how you prove them in GABA. I probably skip them for now. I just move to the hardware part, where I have too many slides as well, and then we come back to what you want. We can go in deeper detail. What is more interesting to you or not, we will see. So I just skip. So yeah, this is really about showing you real code on what, how you do the approximations and how you do the combinations of running errors, etc. So it's getting very technical, and you may consider that it's not interesting for you. You tell me after that. So I move to this one. So that's the second part of my research, and it has almost nothing to do with the first part. It's really about computing just right, but in circuits. In circuits, the nice thing is that you can decide, instead of having to live with this 64-bit format or 32-bit format, you can design your format. You can really shape the bits which are not useful. So it's much more powerful to apply computing just right in this circuit world. Of course, you have to read the binary to get the same. So I'll first do a small introduction to reconfigurable circuit. Who here knows what an FPGA is? Oh, 2, 3. So I'll skip it a bit. So the main motivation for this was FPGAs. And who knows what a Turing machine is? So usually it's not the same people. Okay. So I'll do the introduction to FPGAs by the Turing machine. Do you know what a Turing machine? So it's a finite automaton with infinite memory. And it has a local access to the memory. Okay. So from an implement point of view. And nobody ever built that. Actually, a few people did, but it's for fun. It's not for computing with it. Because it's a very bad model in terms of performance. What people did build is a von Neumann machine. And the nice thing with the von Neumann machine is that it's the same infinite memory, if you want. Well, it's a bit less infinite, but instead of this local access, we have this random access. We send an address and we get the data to any place in constant time in the model, right? And that's much more comfortable to work with. Like can have a program in one corner and the data in another corner, and you don't spend your time moving on the ribbon, like the Turing machine. It's much more efficient, especially since we got rid of disks, of tapes to replace them with disks and with RAM. And actually, that's why the random access memory is called random access. My students always wonder, why do you call that RAM? It's not random. We know exactly, there's no random number generator there. We know exactly what we have in the RAM, right? And the main thing is, people, when they invented RAM, they said, oh, it's so much better than the tape that it got forged in the name. Okay? So that's the efficiency. I can probably skip that, but yeah, of course, random access in constant time is impossible in practice. And that's a law of nature, it's a law of basic complexity. If you have a very large RAM, some of the bits will be very far, and it will take some time at the speed of light to bring them to your processor. So what we have in processors is actually a small bit that computes on a lot of caches on stuff that is here to maintain an illusion of random access. Like all the cache hierarchies in processors are there to maintain the illusion that you have random access to memory in constant time. That was a parenthesis. Meanwhile, von Neumann had a better idea, which was to have also an infinite number of automata. And then you don't need the tape anymore. So that's a cellular automata. You've heard of it also, right? No?
I will ask if I have a question, I will ask you, don't worry.
Actually, I would be interested to know the Russian view on all these historical things, because usually things are invented locally in many places at the same time. And I'm sure many of these things were invented in the East or in China or everywhere at the same time. Anyway, this looks much better because you have an infinite number of automata, so you have more computing power, more parallel computing power. You don't need the tape as soon as these automata can exchange data. And when von Neumann designed it, he really had this local communication. So an automaton reacts to the four neighbors, just like the Turing machine reacts to what's under the reading head. And of course, when we try to build this, to make it practical, we want to have random access, the equivalent of random access. We don't build that, but I first show you that it's easy to build the universal automata like you have here. You just take a small memory here, and you use it. If you fill this memory with bits, you get a truth table. You can put any truth table here, and it can emulate any logic gate. So a memory which has been pre-filled with truth table behaves as a gate. I don't know if it's very clear, otherwise it's not very important. Then you add one bit of register because you need to build any finished state automaton, you need to have computing power on registers, you need to have state. And so that's the content of one of these boxes. And then if you can connect, so you have to choose if it's 4 inputs like here or 6 or 3. It's not very important. But then if you can connect these things to their neighbors, you can do any computation. It's a universal programming model. But for practical reasons, we need something that looks like random access. So we need this box to be able to talk to this box, but also to further boxes. So what we do is, instead of having just one wire, we have routing channels here. Each time two wires intersect, we are able to connect this wire, the wires or not. So either they are connected or they are separated. By having that, you can really have communications from each box to the neighbors. And of course, it makes the box a little bit more complicated, so you have to wire this to this, and it's programmable as well. So that's what an FPGA looks like. So these are actually chips that you can buy. And there's two moments in the life of an FPGA. When you program it, you actually fill all these lookup tables, these small f functions, with truth tables for the function you want to implement. And you have to also define the switching state of each switch of each time two wires cross. So a program is a lot of what you call configuration bits. And then what you get is something like that. So this box emulates this gate, this box emulates this gate. I don't know if you can read it, but the wires have been routed from the outside to the gates on the running circuit, etc. So that's a programmed FPGA. Yeah, and once it's programmed, then you can run it. And running means you just don't touch the configuration anymore, and you let it behave as a circuit that it's emulating. So the programming model that we have is, to program an FPGA, you have to cast a digital circuit into them. Okay, is that clear? So we don't program an FPGA with software, with von Neumann kind of software. We cast a circuit like that. And so you can buy this kind of chips with like, these days it's 1000 by 1000, and there's many more resources than just this logic gate. And initially, these chips were designed to emulate circuits. So when you're designing a graphic processor, you really need a lot of simulation time to get to this kind of scene where you've done millions of computations just to compute all the shades and all the colors of this picture. And if there's one bug in the circuit, it takes ages to find it, because simulation of a circuit is in software. It's just you simulate this, then you simulate this, then you simulate this. So it's iteratively going into all just to do one step of simulation, and then you start again, like you've programmed the game of life once in your life. So it's very, very slow compared to the real circuit. On FPGAs, you can get 1/10 the speed, more or less, until you get to the point where you can detect bugs much faster. There are other applications. If you don't have the money to cast a chip, which is very expensive, then you can buy an FPGA and use it instead of building actually a chip. This is market locking. So what I'm interested in is to use these chips as universal programmable processors. And the thing is, since you have all this, when I connect one gate to another gate, it has to go to all sorts of transistors on the wires. And that's why FPGAs are always 1/10 the speed as normal circuits. There's an overhead of going through these wires, which is so in order to be competitive with processors, you need to program FPGAs in a clever way. And this includes computing just right. So don't compute useless bits. So I don't know if who among you knows how you design a circuit. So again, you don't write a program, you design a circuit. You do. VHDL, you know VHDL? Or Verilog, yeah, it's the same. So I have a few slides. So classical circuits are usually designed using one of these two languages. Compilation looks like normal compilation, except that so there's several steps, but there's two steps which are place and route, which are NP whatever, NP hard, and basically take ages. And it can take 1 week to compile a design for an FPGA. You just do a small modification, press the compile button, and go for 1 week. And so that's a small problem. So that's these two phases are basically, so you have a description of the circuits, you do logic optimizations, that's easy, the Boolean kind of things. Technology mapping consists in finding, you have a graph of gates and you try to gather several gates into one of these boxes, so that's also relatively easy. And then you have to decide, so you have this graph of gates and you have to decide that this one goes here and not here. And maybe it would be better to put it here because then it's closer to this one, but then it's farther from this one, so you try to do the placement in such a way that the overall size of the wires is minimized. But it's very difficult because you have millions. You have a 1 million gate to place. And then the routing consists in actually finding the wires. And here it's constrained by the fact that you have a certain number of wires that you can use between two rows, and you have to live with that. So these two steps are very difficult. very expensive. So usually what you have a problem to compile and you want to accelerate an FPGA and you decompose it into a bit that is written in something like C that goes into the driver. So you have this partitioning step here. So that's C program here on the Verilog or VHDL that goes here. And then you have to debug that they communicate properly. That's very painful. The main thing is this line here, that language for describing circuits are intrinsically parallel. All the gates in the circuit, they operate in parallel. They all live together. It's not like a sequential program where you know that you're there and then after you're there, and after you're there, and you can use a debugger that steps through the program. There's no notion of debugging for a circuit because all the gates live their life in parallel, and that's what makes the thing very difficult. For example, if I write this in VHDL, there's an equivalent syntax in Verilog, it really means there's a gate XOR, that's the way it's connected, its inputs and outputs are connected, but it doesn't mean there's one XOR operation. It describes an infinite number of XOR operations. Okay? And so we have this at the base level, and then we can have a structural approach to combine gates into larger objects, which you combine into larger objects, and that's called the structural construction of circuits. And more recently, we've had a behavioral description of circuits. And that's the kind of dream made true. We want to describe what the circuit does, and let the compiler implement it as a circuit. And finding the right balance between these two approaches is sometimes difficult. Compiling behavior into structure. So eventually we want a netlist of gates, so we want a structural description. So we want this to be compiled into this. And it's easy for simple things, and it's complicated. It is impossible for very complex things, and yeah, it's forever a challenge to do that. Just to have the word semantics in this slide as well. There is a semantics for the behavior of the circuits, and it's called event-based semantics. An event is a wire that changes from 0 to 1 or from 1 to 0. That's called an event, and it happens at some instant. So an event is the name of a signal, of a wire, if you want, the new value of the signal and the time at which it happens. So it's a small triplet. And the semantics of a circuit is how it reacts to a circuit as a black box. You apply events, and you have events that come out. And the semantics of the circuit is a function that transforms the infinite stream of the events and the input into another infinite stream of events and output. And that's very easy to simulate, and that's very easy well, it's not very easy to prove the equivalence of two circuits, for example, but that's the proper semantics that we have for circuits. So that's and VHDL is based on that. Okay, I'll skip that. So I hope that I managed to convey the idea that it's very complex to describe circuits in these languages, because, in particular, because there's this infinite series of events and massive parallelism, so everybody moves at the same time, and it's very difficult to debug. It's not, we are not clever enough. So there's a fashion recently to go for high-level synthesis. High-level synthesis means C to hardware. So it's actually, sometimes it's C++, it's always a subset of C with pragmas, so it's a superset of a subset of C. So you don't want to have pointers, for example, you don't want to have, so it's a very limited, but it's basically the syntax of C. And the motivation is really that if you've taken this subset of C, you can just compile it and run it and simulate it very, very quickly, and with your normal debugging tools, so you can get, you have much higher productivity when you program in these things. And then there's this line, which is the big trick, let the compiler extract the parallelism from the sequential code. So, which is a bit strange. We have a program which is in general quite parallel. Like the example I take is in this the sum, it's actually a reduction operation. So there's a lot of parallelism. You can compute all the multiplications in parallel, right? And then you can do a tree that computes the sum in all sorts of clever ways, like a binary tree to the faster sum. And so we have sequentialized it when we written a program, and we expect the compiler to find the parallelism again. And we do this just because sequential semantics leads to fewer bugs. Yeah, and eventually all these tools, HLS tools, output VHDL. The description of the circuit is either VHDL or Verilog. And so you still have to go to the place and route things. So there's no high-level description of the placement and routing of things. So we still have the 1 week compilation time. So high-level synthesis so far means C. And C is the lowest level, the lowest possible programming level you have above assembly code. So it's quite ironic that high-level synthesis means you design a circuit using C. And the high level means it's high level just because we have reduced the parallelism. We have forced us to use a sequential, which is also ironic, right? So all this is it's very successful. People love it. And I have a very nice example of a colleague, just to show you what you can do with HLS that you cannot do with Verilog or VHL. I've got a colleague who wrote a just-in-time compiler in hardware. So the thesis was you just do this bit that translates your Java into your Java bytecode into machine code. And so it's usually done in software, and he did it in hardware. And it's a very complex operation. It's actually compilation. So you have to detect things, it's got data structures, etc. And he was able to do that in a few months by using HLS tools. And the result is reasonable. So the area of the HLS of the just-in-time compiler it's 1/4 of the processor, so it's not very large. So you can do very complex things, very complex circuits using this approach. And now I'm going to show you my own personal attempt to raise the abstraction level of this high-level synthesis. And I'll do that for some of products, so the core of linear algebra. And we start with these two unsatisfactory solutions. So you can write by hand the VHDL that computes just right. So the question is, what accuracy do I need? How accurate do I compute this? Right. I'm assuming floating point inputs, because that's what MATLAB gives you. That's what people are used to. So I've got a bunch of floating point inputs, some n, and I want to compute this just right. So I'll show you more or less how you do it by hand. But it's so the nice thing is when I do it by hand, I can do my goal of computing just right. But it's a lot of development. It's low level, tedious, error prone, buggy. That's more annoying. It's context dependent, so I cannot write. The problem is that this happens in this situation, where this computation happens somewhere in some other code. It's not the goal per se to compute this. It's embedded inside a matrix product, or it's embedded inside something else. So the context will constrain what you want to do with this operation. And if I write one instance of one operator that computes this, I have lost the context. Or I have to be generic enough for all the context. So the other approach is to write everything in C, and you push the button for the HLS. It's supposed to be fast. It's faster actually. But I lose the possibility of going to the bit level the way I want. And I'll show you exactly why. I'm bound by the C semantics. And the semantics of C for floating point is quite strict. In particular, I think it's there. No. So just to show you what it means to do just the summation part in floating point. So that's the exponent in purple, and that's the mantisol. Right, and there's a hidden one which we add, which happens. So here there's a 1 here. Because the first bit is not a 0, it's always a 1, so it's not stored. So we add it back here. So the first iteration of the loop, I take this number, I shift it to a proper place according to its exponents, and I add it. If you want to take decimal digits given by a pocket calculator, it's really the same thing you would do. So the second one has different exponents, so I shift it by a different amount, x1, and then I add it. And here it turns out that the bits which were lost are zeros, so the result is okay. It's the same result on both sides. Yeah, here I do the operation if I had an infinitely accurate result. And here I do the operation in floating point. So I have a finite, my running sum is stored in a floating point number, so I have to truncate it at this place. Yeah, and when I add the third number, and the fourth number, compared to the running sum is much smaller, so we actually lose all the bits when we shift it to this place. All the bits which were here must be rounded off because we have only this space to store the result. So if you go on for a while, the exact result had that many bits. The floating point accumulation is very inaccurate because it shifted out a lot of bits, including a full x5 was completely shifted out. And if we had an infinite accurate accumulator, we would have this number. And by just fixing the size of the accumulator here and here, we have a result which is already much closer to the exact result. That's the idea. So computing just right here would mean fix the size of this accumulator. There's one very architectural thing here is that adding things to an accumulator is much faster than adding things to a floating point number because it's fixed point, but I'll probably skip it. Just back to a high level. So I want to know how many bits I should have in this accumulator. And this is actually a problem from the context. How large can someone get? So can it move to the left or how large can the sum get? Because if I do a rounding error here after n accumulation of size n, how large can the sum get? It takes me here. So it defines the most significant bit of the accumulator. And then how accurate do I want the result? That defines this last bit. But there's also the impact of the number of terms. So if I round off some terms here, I have an error, and this error is multiplied by n in the worst case. So I have to add log n bits here just to cater for the rounding errors. That's again, accumulation of round-off errors. So a combination of these two questions, how accurate you want the result and how many terms you have, defines the least significant bit. And in particular, in an HLS context, how many terms? That's something you infer from the context. So the compiler knows that. It knows how many terms you have. This looks a very tricky questions to answer, but we are actually protected by the fact that, again, 3 orders of magnitude, which is very large. So you usually know to answer these questions within 3 orders of magnitude. And that's only 10 bits. So it doesn't add much to just to be very conservative and take overestimations of your accuracy and errors by 3 orders of magnitude. And it will add 10 bits to the accumulator. So Floboco is a VHDL code generator, which actually has this kind of generic interface. You say, I want an accumulation, you give the high-level parameters, which are more or less these ones, and you get VHDL. But you have to do by hand. You take the problem, compute the high-level parameters by hand, and then you can use Floboco. So it doesn't solve all the problem. And also, it doesn't know how many terms you want to add, so basically, it doesn't benefit from the context. And so this work was to infer these parameters from the C code. And the problem we see is that it has a semantics. So for example, the floating point addition in C is not you're not allowed to reorder the computations in C. And that's what I'm doing. I'm exploiting parallelism when I'm doing that. And then you have this float on double formats, and you have nothing in between. I want to have an accumulator which has something in between. So what we do is just suggest that, okay, we take the C syntax if you want, but use it as a high-level language. So virtually you don't want to compute with float, you want something that is real. So you express a computation, and that's high level. And then you have to specify the accuracy, you have to specify the low-level information, which is how many bits do you want, or how accurate do you want to be. And you add pragmas for that. And so that's the goal is to make high-level synthesis finally high-level. So that's a kind of software. So there's colleagues in REN who develop a source-to-source compiler. So it's a Java framework where you that parses C and then gives you the tree and all sorts of nice graphs, like the graphs I have here are output automatically from this tool. So we just wrote a plugin, which is an arithmetic optimization plugin. We wrote this accumulation, special accumulators. So I don't detail this. This is a new architecture for doing the accumulation, which is not the floating point accumulation. So I have slides for it, but I don't want to detail them. And what we do is we take some C with pragma, we modify it here, and we output a new version of the C code, which is more accurate and faster, and which relies on this library, and then the HLS tool will compile it into VHDL. So that's just to show that it's not just a simple accumulation. We can have several arbitrary code, and that's where the compiler approach is better than the Floboko approach. So we take arbitrary code here, and we had this pragma that. So I really wanted to replace the float with a real, but it was a bit too complicated for JCOS. Technically, this should be called real now. And we just have a pragma that says that the variable sum has that's the maximum value it can take, and that's the epsilon I want it to be accurate. And that's high level. Well, and so there's all sorts of code transformations. So that's the initial graph where I had multiple additions, another addition, etc. And we can either transform it into a graph of operators like that. We just take floating point operators. So that's very straightforward. You see when you have the graph of computation. And that's actually what HLS does. HLS does extract this graph and then replace each of the operations. There's still some parallelism that is exploited here. Like if you do the sum of two multiplications, you will launch the two multipliers in parallel. There's not in this example, I think. There's no parallelism here, but in principle there's parallelismic extraction in this process. And the small digits I have here is the number of cycles that each operation takes. And in particular, the annoying one is that the addition takes 7 cycles, which means that we have to wait for 7 cycles before we can start the next addition. And to get rid of this problem, you can rewrite your code so that you have 7 sub-addition in parallel inside one floating point adder. But it's not, the compiler will not do it automatically because it's not legal C. You're changing the order of operations. So they don't do it. And so that's the transformer code. So the tool that my PhD student wrote, it transforms this into this. And here the nice thing is that we do the transformation to fixed point as early as possible, and then we have fixed point operations which take 1 cycle only. So all this takes 1 cycle. And the nice thing is that here I have a graph which is more complex than the one which I can produce with Floboko. In the sense that it combines several floating point operations. Basically, I've dismantled each floating point operation into its basic components. And then I do the optimizations at the level of these basic components. Yeah, and that's what I was able to do with Floboco. Was only this float to fix, fix add, fix to float, and that's all the components I have in Floboco. And here I have a combination which is much more complex. And so that's the proof of the pooling. So for this example, you get this, but it's not very important. The important thing is that I can get something much more accurate. It costs me, so that's the cost in the lookup tables. You remember it's a logic gate. So it costs me a little bit more, but it's not. At least I can control the accuracy. So if I want guaranteed accuracy of 1 to the 7, I get more or less the same cost, and then I can get much higher accuracy. And actually save on DSP, and that's the technical thing. So there's a saving here, and the main saving is actually that I go from 2,000 cycles to 100 cycles, and that's mostly because yeah, it's actually 20 cycles. I don't know. I don't remember why, but it's because of this kind of reason. We can launch one addition each cycle. And we evaluated that on a benchmark suite, which is called FPMark, and it contains 10 kernels, 5 of which contain accumulations. So that's a C benchmark, which is supposed to be for embedded whatever. I don't remember what it means, but it's a C benchmark. So we just looked visually where we have an accumulation, and for each accumulation we implemented very accurately, re-implemented it to get the exact result, and then we did experiments transforming that into the. Yeah. And one thing which is funny is that among these 10 benchmark, one is expecting you to compute completely wrong. So it's a floating point benchmark, and they within the benchmark, you know, since it's used for comparing optimizations, they give you the golden reference, and you're supposed to compute the golden reference, otherwise you don't pass the benchmark. And one of the golden references has only one significant digit correct, and all the rest are completely wrong. And so you are supposed to compute wrong to pass the benchmark. So that was one of the interesting results of this one. Yes, just to show that in general we can reach with the modified version. We can reach comparable accuracy with much lower latency and fewer resource consumption, or comparable resource consumption. So you have to make DSPs are the multipliers which are embedded in the. So, and the important thing is that for Fourier, for example, that's the one which has only 6 accurate bits, and we can get the same result. When it's not available, it's because it's a while loop. So the tool doesn't report how many cycles it takes because there's a while loop. But actually, we have the same ratio. We improve the latency. So going high level, again, the main thing we gain is that we control the accuracy instead of hoping for the best. Yeah. So the conclusion of this part about hardware is, you have a very expensive processor here, a very expensive FPGA here, and I'm still wondering which one is better for computing, knowing that this one has only this to compute and the rest is for administration, and this one has only this to compute and all the rest is for wiring, for routing. So both of them are a lot of wasted silicon. And that's it for this part. Should make up slides, but then for questions.
So I know a lot of papers that are devoted to deriving hardware for neural networks.
Mm-hmm.
First step was to come to binarized network, neural network.
Mm-hmm.
It is done in different ways. One of them is just simulate the network, neural network. And then this binarized network is implemented as a hardware using FPGA.
Yes.
And then they optimize it using optimization methods to digital circuits, etc. How your work and that big paper of papers correlate?
It's a very interesting question because of course everybody is doing deep neural networks these days, and the two questions I have, which are how accurate do you compute on what accuracy do you need? In particular, what accuracy do you need? Nobody is able to answer this question for neural networks. So what they know is that for training you need more accuracy. You need a lot of accuracy for training, but then for the binarization is only for the production part, right? It's not for training.
Yeah, training
Yes.
is done already.
Yes,
Suppose
yes.
that neural work is already
And so
derived.
the reason why I like this binary, actually I have one colleague doing ternary neural networks, which is more or less the same, it's just 0, -1 or 1. And they have a measure of accuracy, which is not at all the accuracy I have, which is the percentage of success on these benchmarks, how you recognize. And to reach the same accuracy, so in this sense, they need more layers. So the people who do the study properly, they show that you can have binary networks that work almost as well as normal networks, but they need to have more layers. So instead of having more resolution in this dimension of numbers, they need more resolution in the depth of the network, and that's something that nobody really understands at the moment. So again, I'd like people to work a bit more on what kind of accuracy do you need for these applications.
Yes.
And actually, people just try. You tweak a parameter, you retry, you tweak a parameter. And it's very interesting that they eventually get to something considering how. But there's a momentum. So Facebook is doing a chip with a kind of 8-bit strange floating point format in it. Google is doing a chip with 8-bit fixed points. And so there's a lot of, and I don't know who's going to win among the two.
Since there is limited memory, you don't have another way.
Yes.
You need to construct something.
But for example, the Facebook chip, they do have exactly this accumulator which I have. I don't have even that with my long accumulator actually. No. So they have they do something like that. So they have internally more accuracy because you are summing. It is actually an instance of this computation. So you have 8-bit number coming in. You do the product. You get like 16-bit numbers, and you add them into an accumulator like that. And they do that. The interesting thing is in Facebook they do that in the log domain. So they do the multiplication in the log domain. So it's an addition. So the numbers are not floating point numbers, but are logarithms of the numbers they manipulate. So to do the multiplication, they do just an addition, which is cheap. Then they have a lookup table that transforms this log into a fixed point number that they accumulate using another adder. So they do this computation using two additions. That's Facebook. And I don't know if it's good or bad because
Once they know how, so it's difficult to check. Also for smartphone, so also is a chip.
Yes.
So, but they immediately say it is know-how. So we go our way, just compare the results for benchmarks. We cannot do more. And I have another question. Okay, Flora. Now there is, for example, CIPROC makes no difference, neural network, and we would like to implement it as a chip. So we try to transform how somehow to a higher level description. And how do we know that we have transformed it correctly? How do we check that we have bought exactly?
So it actually works quite well. But I don't know if you program GPUs, it's a bit the same. So
we use also things that are there.
Yeah. So you just take your C program and first it has to be simple enough that you don't have pointers, for example. You have to, so it has to be a kernel, kind of, just computations. And then you run it, and it tells you how many cycles. So you run it for a given size, like want to do something on 1,000, and then it tells you I need 100,000 cycles, and you know that something is wrong. And then you look at where the parallelism. It means it doesn't find the parallelisms that it should find. And you can have pragmas that tell it that this loop is parallel, for example. The parallel loop.
The program is complex.
And then the problem gets more complex, exactly.
Yeah.
But the thing is, the pragma doesn't prevent you from running the code to check that you've not broken anything. So the simulation is so much faster that it makes development faster. But eventually you get a much larger program.
Yeah, I understand, but the problem is which buttons take.
So that's why this kind of approach is the good one. That you still start from something which is very small, and the code that comes out here is much larger than the code that we input. So it's compiled.
For special classes, I agree, it can be done, but if the program is very complex, I still think that some verification tests are needed.
But the FP benchmarks are quite complex, actually. It's real C code cut from real applications, and so
just random simulation, you think it is enough? In fact, you have random simulation. You don't derive these patterns to simulate them.
So so the question is how I am sure that for this answer that I have to get back to the other one. To the other, so again, for elementary functions, I have it's a simple problem. I just show you something where I know how to do it. It's an elementary function, so it has a mathematical definition that dates back from Euler, and everybody agrees on that. And it's a very pure mathematical object. And then I can do a proof that for any input I will be close to the approximation. Okay, and the proof is in two parts. First, the program is using an approximation, so that's a polynomial that approximates 2 to the 2e to the y for a small y. So basically, it's a polynomial written in a strange way because we want the coefficients to be exactly the coefficients. So you don't have to have decimal here because 0.1 cannot be represented exactly in decimal. So it would introduce a subtle error somewhere. So we have hexadecimal coefficients in floating point. Most people don't know that you can have a floating point hexadecimal notation. So then I have two problems in this code. I have an approximation problem, so that I want to compute this, but I actually use this polynomial. For this, and again, this is not written in the code. That's the part that. And for this, I can use mathematical, numerical mathematical tools that give me a bound of the difference between the polynomial and the function I want to approximate. And I choose the polynomial of high degree so that the bound is within, it's much smaller than 1 to the minus 18, this example. So that's one part of the problem. And the other part is this. So the code that I compute is doing a lot of running errors. So each of these operations involves potentially a running error. So when I do this addition here, it's going to run the result. And I want to manage the accumulation of all these running errors.
I understood. My question was a bit different. Suppose you have a C program. You have some tool that you just submit a C program and you apply a description in level. Is it right? Or
yes,
still there are some work that you done manually. The C program is too big.
No, it's automatic, but then the C program is not going, the Verilog is not going to be efficient. If you want it to be efficient, you have to understand what's happening and iterate a bit.
So it's some manual work.
Yes, but it's at the source level, so it's not that bad. And then you have to trust the compiler. Of course, and that's do you trust your compiler?
No, we didn't work with this program. We worked with support vector machines and neural networks. We tried to implement it with objects.
But then you have you have a framework that in these I don't know support virtual machines, but I know the frameworks that do neural networks, and you have to trust the frameworks now.
The acceleration is wonderful. Fantastic.
Yeah. And then to on the problem of having the proper test cases.
Yeah. Exactly. To be sure that
in neural networks, nobody cares. Like there's all these adversary neural networks that prove that you can.
Until a false found.
Yeah, until and I don't want my car to be driven by something that can make such horrible mistakes. But you know all this paper that gives you a cat picture and it's recognized as a penguin or whatever. It's not that nobody cares. People care, but nobody understands it far enough to. And again, it's already half my life I spent doing this simple object that is an elementary function. And we have to go up from that. That's the message.
If it is the recognition for the test level, for example, in IoT, in this case, we do care that there's no faults. Neural networks are not applied only for image recognition. For example, can be applied for evaluating the class level in IoT. In this case, we do care.
There's one additional problem is that all I'm doing is generating hardware which is unique. Like in Floboco, you can do all sorts of operators which are just designed to solve one problem.
Exactly.
And then, for this reason, Floboco also generates the test bench along with the operator itself, because nobody can trust something that nobody else tried before.
Yeah.
So you have to generate the test bench, but then it has to. There will be a random test somewhere at some point.
No, I can send you the reference. They published a paper at ICSoft 2018. So you always can get access to it.
With pleasure.
Yeah, if you like, not a problem. Thank you very much.
More questions?
Yes?
Question a bit aside, but you studied this topic for many years, I think. What your impression of the demand of this result? For example, I'm a system programmer, and when I talk with applied mathematicians who solve differential equations, large-scale problems on supercomputers, and ask, do you need high precision? They say, oh yes, of course, just if I press button and it compute more precision, it will be okay. Then I say, could you invest some effort to prepare your program for high precision, or maybe some money from your project to support us to doing tools for you? They say, no,
we don't need it.
This is a common impression. What do you think about this impression?
It's very true. It's not true in all the fields. I worked a lot with CERN in Geneva, because we are close to Geneva. And there they have these huge simulations that I'll tell you the story of the code they have. It's a simulation for particle physics and high energy physics, and it's the same code basically. They improve it every year, but it started with Fortran code in the 60s. And it started basically before the invention of floating point, or at the time where floating point was different in each computer. So there was no standard and no standard number of bits, etc. So in Fortran, the floating point type is called real, which is interesting. So it's not called float; it's called a real. It's a real number. And so the physicists tend to consider it as a real value and have an infinite number of digits, infinite accuracy, which is not the case, of course. So then this code, and it worked, and they had more and more powerful computers, and the code worked on larger and larger problems, and suddenly the code breaks. It doesn't work anymore. The problem becomes too large, and the code doesn't work anymore. And this happens in the 80s. And they were really annoyed because the code didn't work anymore. And then in the 80s, there was this standard for floating point, which brought to the standard PCs double precision. So until then, it was more or less single precision 32-bit number. In various standards. So they say, okay, let's try to switch everything to double precision, and the code works again. So they keep using the same code, and the problem grows. And in 2015, some physicists contacted me and said that it broke again. So we need more precision. Can you give us quad precision? So 128-bit formats. And so they started in 5 years ago to pressure people to add quad precision. So it was in 2010. Anyway, in 2008 we added to the standards for floating point a quad precision format just to please these people, but nobody used it. Nobody built this standard because it doesn't make sense from the application point of view. It's better to look at the code and fix it. But they don't want to do that because it's code written in the 60s in Fortran by people who are gone to retirement for a long time, and nobody understands it. And it's not this kind of code. It's like you have a loop nest of depth 8, so 8 loops implicated. And in the middle, they know that it computes some eigenvalue for some matrix. And the real question is, what is the to be able to understand to be able to understand what the code is computing, you need to have a reference. So this slide is not very. This is an important slide. Accuracy is really something that can be defined by subtraction. An error is the difference between the proper result, or an accurate value, and the value you compute. For example, the error of one single addition is, with reference to exact addition, is bounded by the standard, and you know exactly what it is. The approximation error of the polynomial, it's a difference between two mathematical objects, which I can evaluate, and I can have a bound which is more or less safe. But the error of one of these floating point addition within this computation of eigenvalues of some particle physics, nobody understands what it's supposed to compute. What's the real world equivalent of this eigenvalue we're computing? So that's the main question to answer, and it's far beyond the horizon at the moment. So I have no hope that we get to that, but we do it by steps, and that's the big picture. And one more thing I would say, they have a team which reverse engineers the old code. And like in the code, you have a multiplication by 0.8 in some computation of some physics, integral of something, and there's a 0.8. They wonder what is 0.8? It's trying to have a one-digit number, and we have a problem of accuracy using 16-digit numbers, so maybe there's something wrong here. So they look at why do they use 0.8, and they look for the paper which was used the same value as the previous paper, which is the same value as the previous paper. Eventually they come back to a very old paper that says we tried 0.6, 0.7, 0.8, 0. On 1.0, and 0.8 was the best result we could get. And then they do the same experiment again with a larger precision to refine the value of 0.8. You see, so it's full of things that people don't really understand, and that's the main problem. The information you need is just not in the code. Even where does this 0.8 come from? You have to look at the first paper that was published about this code. And it says, oh, we took 0.8 because everybody does. And then you look at the papers at the time, etc. And just to say that where we can be formal is that once you decided that an error is the difference between what you compute and what you want to compute, you can use this very simple trick, which is to add intermediate objects. So this difference is equal to this, and now I have appearing in blue the polynomial approximation error, so that's a difference between two mathematical objects. And then the polynomial is not exactly what I compute because I have rounding errors, and the rounding errors are captured as the difference between what I compute and the polynomial, the mathematical polynomial, and the same input. And then you can round that by triangular inequality, and then it's not done, you have to recurse on to compute the accumulation of rounding errors. So this one is solved, and you have to recurse on the other one. And I had 20 slides to show you how to record, so this is not trivial, but we can do it. So we are slowly improving the understanding of things. And it's upset. It's hopeless in the general case. Nobody knows what you're computing.
More questions? I have a very practical one. So we mentioned a couple of tools, Flow 4 and
JCOS?
JCOS, yes. They are open source.
Yes.
And what licenses are distributed under?
For JCOS, I'm not sure. For Flowpoco, there's no license, so it's free for academic use.
For academic only?
The license is all rights reserved, so you have to ask me before doing whatever, which is just looking at the code and trying it is free, it's open source. But distributing and the reason why I don't use GPL is that I would like to be GPL kind of license, but the Flowpoco is actually generating code, and GPL will prevent, and the generated code embeds all the clever stuff I've put in Flowpoco, so I want the generated code to be protected by the GPL as well, under license. And the GPL prevents doing that. So for the GPL, you can have no restriction on the use of the code, and having a license on the generated code is a restriction on the use of the code. So I cannot use directly the GPL, and it's been 10 years I've been developing Flowpoco, and the lawyers of my employers are unable to give me a proper license, so it's just case-by-case discussion. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
So we really have a practical problem with the standard licenses. So it could be a MIT license, because then there's no... But I still want to control a bit what happens with Flowpoco. In particular, when I started, the big fashion was high-speed trading using FPGAs. And I didn't want Flowpoco to be used for high-speed trading, so I put a license that specifically excludes high-speed trading, which is the nuisance. So, this kind of things.
One more question. So Flowpoco supports only HDL,
yes.
Right? So Verilog is not supported.
No, it's deeply. It will never happen that it supports Verilog, because Flowpoco is really the main motivation in the start was that people who can program in VHDL can also program in Flowpoco. So it's really, you print out VHDL in the stream, and that's and then there's a lot of things that we added on top of that, but at the core it's still printing VHDL to a stream, and we cannot. And yeah, it's not the best choice. Verilog is a bit more elegant, but when I started the project, I had to. One of the motivations was to recycle a lot of code written by students and put it in one single tool. And we wrote the first elementary functions in hardware, to the first sine and cosine and expand log, with the first 5 PGAs. And it was written by different students, and we had to write small scripts that generated parts of the code. And eventually we decided to put everything in one single tool. But we wanted to recycle this VHDL to reuse it. So that's why we didn't start from scratch. Yes.
Just a side question. I can understand the real value of your approach to just write for hardware, yes. But do you think it is so important for software, since we're bound by memory access, basically, where
So
there's some computation to guide these labels.
That's very true. There's still a tendency these days to try to get the code that is written for double precision back to single, or at least as much as possible, so that you can save on the memory accesses. So,
yes.
So to do that, you need to solve exactly the same question. So how accurate you compute at each point, etc. I don't know if I answered the question, but there's still a motivation. It's done in Berkeley by what's his name, James Nimel, for example. So that people do that. And it's the same problem. You have many variables, and you want to know which ones you can downgrade to single precision on the basis.
Obviously, yes, that's right. Just altering math functions to reduce latency even more. Is it so important?
No, and in software, what I showed you is more, you compute just right in terms of launching the accurate computations. And this is a very, very general technique, like iterative refinement for even algebra, for solvers, for these kind of things. So we really want to understand what's the quality of your result, to know if you want to improve it further, or just you can refine it. And so all these tools which we set up to understand how we compute, we can use them in this field. But again, we started with the easy problems. Like elementary functions, it looks complicated, but it's actually the easiest thing. It's much simpler than linear algebra. So we started with the simple thing and took 3 PhDs, and we progress on the higher levels.
More questions?
Thank you once again.
Thank you very much.